Thank you.
Oh dear, not being photographed with a glass in my hand.
With a glass of water.
If we are to preserve democracy, we must identify and isolate those elements which subvert it, which are its enemies.
I will never negotiate with people who use coercion and violence to achieve their objective.
The hard left, the terrorist gangs within our borders, these are the very dangers that we face in Britain today.
The unions are obviously one body where a fanatical, tiny fanatical minority can and seem to be able to take over a whole union.
As somebody once said, when politicians start to talk about morality, you'd better count the spoons.
Are you encouraged that President Chernenko has said the Soviet Union won't target Britain if Britain gives up its nuclear weapons?
If war were ever to start, you could never rely on any such assurance.
Even if every nuclear weapon were destroyed, the knowledge of how to make them cannot be disinvented.
What we really need is the United States and the Soviet Union back at the table.
Our party can reasonably claim to be the leading democratic party in the world. Oh, I think you should clap that.
My lords, ladies, guests and fellow members, it is my great pleasure and honour to welcome you this evening to the Carlton Lecture. The Carlton Lecture was inaugurated in 1982 to mark the 150th anniversary of our club. The first lecture was given in this room by our president, then Mr. Harold Macmillan, and I can see many here tonight who were in that room on that most memorable occasion. The political committee had but one name when our minds turned to planning the second Carlton Lecture. Why Democracy Will Last is the title of tonight's lecture. Prime Minister, on behalf of us all here tonight, I welcome you not only as our leader, but as a friend amongst friends, and invite you to deliver the second Carlton Lecture to those of us who are fortunate to be here in this room and in this club tonight, and to the wider audience that will see, hear, and read your lecture. Prime Minister.
Mr. Chairman, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, just over 2 years ago, as you have reminded us, Mr. Harold Macmillan delivered the first Carlton Lecture. All of us who were present to hear it, or who have since read it, hoped that this would be the first of a distinguished series. And you do me great honour in inviting me to deliver the second. When he was Prime Minister, Mr. Macmillan gave me my first ministerial job in 1961. Some 20 years later, as Prime Minister myself, it gave me the greatest pleasure to recommend Mr. Macmillan for his highly deserved and widely acclaimed earldom on the occasion of his 90th birthday. Today, the Earl of Stockton may have a distinguished title, he may sit in a different chamber, but he speaks with the brilliance, wit, and understanding with which he has always spoken. His lecture was entitled Civilization Under Threat, because he thought, and I quote his own words, something vague and meaningless and a little pompous would be about right. Needless to say, the lecture was everything but that. The title I first toyed with for my lecture was Democracy Under Threat, because there are, as we know, enemies of democracy both within and without. But that would have been too pessimistic a title, because the defenders of democracy are far the more numerous. The overwhelming majority of the British people are Democrats. Britain's democratic institutions are resilient, and the heart of our country is strong. I have confidence and faith in our people, and therefore have called my lecture, Why Democracy Will Last. Now, we meet here as practitioners in the craft of democracy. Indeed, this great club is a workshop of that craft. The families of some of those in this room have been practicing this skill for several generations. Others have become master craftsmen in one generation. Still more are serving their apprenticeships for the future. Democracy has always been and remains one of the rarer forms of government. The United Nations now numbers 159 countries, but no more than about 60 could be described as democracies. So steady and inevitable was our own progress towards democracy, so familiar are the landmarks, Magna Carta 1215, Simon de Montfort's Parliament in 1265, habeas corpus in 1679, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the Reform Bills from 1832 leading to universal suffrage. So steady and inevitable was that progress that it's easy to forget how unusual is our history. If we look wider, in the past or the present, we see not only how rare, but how vulnerable democracy is. The brief flowering of Athens in the ancient world, the instant destruction of the fledgling Russian democracy in 1917 by Lenin's coup d'etat, and the infancy of most real democracies outside Europe now. And even if we look at the kind of representative democracy which we practice in Britain today, we realize how long has been the road from Runnymede. As you know, Mr. Chairman, I always quote some of Kipling in every speech. He had a marvelous poem, The Reeds of Runnymede. At Runnymede, your rights were won at Runnymede. No freeman shall be fined or bound or dispossessed of freehold ground, except by lawful judgment, found and passed upon him by his peers. Forget not, after all these years, the charter signed at Runnymede. And still, when mob or monarch lays too rude a hand on English ways, the whisper wakes, the shudder plays across the reeds at Runnymede. And Thames that knows the mood of kings, and crowds and priests and such like things, rolls deep and dreadful as he brings their warning down from Runnymede. The first of the great parliamentary reform bills actually occurred in the lifetime of the father of one member of our present House of Lords, Lady Elliot of Harwood. Her father, Sir Charles Tennant, was born in 1823. Votes for women, albeit for those aged 30 or over, were one of the few beneficial consequences of the First World War. That was the only time when the age of 30 in the life of women has been of statutory significance. Votes for women under 30 on the same terms as men came during my own lifetime. It was as late as 1950, by which time the university seats had been abolished, that the first general election was held based on the principle of one person, one vote. 1950. How recent, then, is democracy, in one sense, even in our own country? But freedom depends on more than just a voting system. And long before democracy was valued, long before we had this form of representative government, long before universal suffrage, we prided ourselves on being a free people. We'd freed ourselves from fear of foreign domination. We'd freed ourselves from absolute monarchy. Above all, we developed the common law, which established protection for the common man against the overmighty and powerful. The debt we owe to our judges over many centuries has been incalculable. There is perhaps no more eloquent statement of 18th century England's reverence for freedom than that attributed to Chief Justice Lord Mansfield in the case of James Somerset, the slave. He said, "The air of England has long been too pure for a slave, and every man is free who breathes it. Every man who comes into England is entitled to the protection of English law, whatever oppression he may heretofore have suffered, and whatever may be the colour of his skin." That was in the 18th century, long before even the great reform bills. We would have called ourselves a free people long before we had today's form of representative democracy. By the 19th century, Tennyson, the great poet of my native Lincolnshire, was able to call this nation a land of settled government, a land of just renown. But if we are to preserve and indeed strengthen democracy, we must encourage those forces which sustain it, which are friendly to it, and identify and isolate those elements which subvert it, which are its enemies. And the democracy of which we speak is not the counterfeit model of communism, but genuine democracy. Mr. Chairman, economists and politicians have not always been the friends of freedom. Indeed, one of them would have led us into serfdom from the middle-class comfort of a house in Highgate and from the publicly provided reading rooms of the British Museum. But others knew more of human nature and had more respect for the importance of the individual. Great political economists, the greatest of them, Adam Smith, have shown how a market economy, by devolving the power of consumer choice to customers, runs with the grain of democracy, which disperses the power of political choice to voters. The economic enemies of democracy are those who would impose on people systems of production and distribution based on compulsion, not on people's choice. Many live under systems whose rulers know only too well the connection between economic and political freedom, for they suppress economic freedoms precisely to prevent that political freedom which would ultimately follow. But are there not closer to home some trends and fashions of thought which contain in more respectable guise the seed of the same danger? There are. If some powerful group of producers says to us, "You've got to buy our product, whether or not you want it," will force you to do so by use of monopoly power or political muscle, then those producers are taking away from their fellow citizens an economic freedom. And that is true, even if we were feeble enough to vote to allow it because we thought anything for a quiet life. Oh, I've heard that phrase in my political lifetime. Anything for a quiet life. And if we voted for that, we would be taking away our economic freedoms, and our economic freedoms underpin our political freedoms, and our political freedoms are democracy. And if they are prepared to rob us of our economic freedoms, what is to stop that group of producers from trying to take away other freedoms as well? Let us never forget, democracies can, and in the past have, voted for measures which lead to their own destruction. The job of democratic leaders is to warn that measures which may seem easy or even popular, which may end some immediate conflict, must be resisted if in the end they risk destroying democracy itself. Doubtless, consensus politicians mocked Demosthenes when he warned that the blandishments of King Philip of Macedon had only one object, the extinction of freedom in the Greek cities. But he was right. They certainly mocked Churchill in a comparable case, and he was right too. Doubtless we could settle back into allowing industries which we know should modernize to levy on us all the compulsory costs of their own inefficiency, of their own protection. But that way lies in the end the erosion of the economic freedoms on which democracy rests, just as surely as Greek weakness in the face of the Macedonian king led to the extinction of political freedoms. So, certain economic systems, the market economy, is the friend of democracy. It underpins it. Technology, too, has profound implications for political life. Huge concentrations of people in great buildings simply repeating mechanical routines will be a thing of the past, and thank goodness for that. We can look forward to more and varied work being dispersed among smaller groups, less mass organization of people for mechanical purposes, more dispersal of economic power. All these things bode well for a diverse and democratic society. But other technical developments are more somber. In the last century, the Swiss cantons secure in their mountains, Britain secure behind her navy, the New England cities far from European dynastic wars, all could live in confident independence because, with reasonable vigilance, there was not much danger of destruction from outside. Powerful modern weapons and nuclear technology will never again allow us to live in so secure a world. Even if every nuclear weapon were destroyed, the knowledge of how to make them cannot be disinvented. Now only a ceaseless vigilance can keep us safe. But having said all this, I said a little bit about how economics can affect democracy, how technology can affect it. Let us never forget that the case for democracy rests ultimately on morality. Now, somebody once said, I can't remember who it was, that when politicians start to talk about morality, you'd better count the spoons. But there's no way round the word if we are to discuss what is the greatest internal threat to democracy. In the old days, political writers used to argue about the protection of minorities. How, they said, could minority groups in a democracy be protected against the majority? Surely the 51% might claim legitimacy for persecution of the 49%. But democracy is about more than majorities. It is about the right of every individual to freedom and justice, a right founded upon the Old and New Testaments, which remind us of the dignity of each individual, his right to choose, and his duty to serve. These rights are God-given and not state-given. They are rights which have been evolved and upheld across the centuries by our rule of law, a rule of law which safeguards individuals and minorities, a rule of law which is the cement of a free society. But what I think we are now seeing is the reverse problem, and we haven't properly faced up to it yet. The problem of the protection of the majority. Because there's come into existence a fashionable view, convenient to many special interest groups, that there's no need to accept the verdict of the majority, that the minority should be quite free to bully, even coerce, to get the verdict reversed. Marxists, of course, always had an excuse when they were outvoted. Their opponents, they said, must have false consciousness. Their views didn't really count. But the Marxists, as usual, provide only bogus intellectual top-dressing for groups who seek only their own self-interest. Plenty of groups operate more simply. They don't care whether they have persuaded their fellow citizens or not, or whether constitutionally elected governments undertake properly approved policies. These minorities will coerce the system to meet their own objectives if we let them get away with it. Many of the new campaigning pressure groups, run by professionals who move from campaign to campaign, some in the trade unions, some even in parts of the system of government itself, they have seen how our democracy has evolved rules to temper the power of the majority, and rightly so, and to provide safeguards and rights for the minority. They have spotted that if minorities bend the rules or simply ignore them, they may succeed in manipulating the whole system. The minority, indeed, may in the end effectively coerce the majority. You may recall that Burke had a phrase for it, as always. All that is needed for evil men to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Now, I hope I won't be thought too provocative if I complain again about the sloppy use of the word consensus in such cases. If there is a national debate and a constitutional vote about some matter, and if a recalcitrant minority says, the vote be damned, we're going to do our level best to stop the majority having its way, then, Mr. Chairman, it's no good saying we must seek consensus, we must negotiate, because such a group will never consent, whatever the majority thinks, until it gets what it wants. That is when we have to stand up and be counted. That is when we have to do what we believe to be right. We must never give in to the oldest and least democratic trick of all, the coercion of the many by the ruthless manipulating few. As soon as we surrender the basic rule which says that we must persuade our fellow citizens, not coerce them, then we have joined the ranks of the enemies of democracy. And now that democracy has been won, it is not heroic to flout the law of the land as if we still struggled in a quagmire where civilization had yet to be built. The concept of fair play, a British way of saying respect for the rules, must not be used to allow the minority to overbear the tolerant majority. Yet these are the very dangers that we face in Britain today. At one end of the spectrum are the terrorist gangs within our borders and the terrorist states which finance and arm them. At the other are the hard left, operating inside our system, conspiring to use union power and the apparatus of local government to break, defy, and subvert the law. Their course of action is characterized by a calculated hostility to our courts of justice. Now, our courts have long been distinguished for their impartiality. Our judges are famous for their fair-mindedness, their objectivity, and their learning. But it is precisely because the courts uphold the principles of reason, justice, and equality before the law that the fascist left is contemptuous of them. Who is there to speak for the majority? The Labour Party can't. It is itself the victim of a takeover of the passive majority by a ruthless minority. We see moderate Labour politicians having to eat their words or take their leave. And the alliance? It is a house divided. Divided on principle, divided on policy, divided not once, but many times over. A unique responsibility is therefore placed on today's Conservative Party. And speaking to you in this building, it is right that I should dwell for a moment on the role of our party. There are in the free world a number of powerful and distinguished parties in the Conservative tradition. But I think it's fair to say that none can rival our own Conservative Party for the length of its service to the nation, the durability of its philosophy, its tenacity of tradition, combined with its willingness to embrace and refine necessary change, and above all, for the sheer centrality of its role in the political life of our society. Our party can reasonably claim to be the leading democratic party in the world. Oh, I think you should clap that. In our long history, the Conservative Party, as our name implies, has sought successfully to conserve many things: the established church, the monarchy, the House of Lords, the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom. But now, the mantle has fallen on us to conserve the very principle of parliamentary democracy and the rule of law itself, to conserve them for all people, of all parties, and of none. Mr. Chairman, each generation has to stand up for democracy. It can't take anything for granted and may have to fight fundamental battles anew. You know that marvelous quotation from Goethe, "That which thy fathers bequeathed thee, earn it anew, if thou wouldst possess it." My predecessor in the first Carlton Lecture dealt eloquently with the whole of civilization. Only he could, the whole of civilization. The culture of the cities of Guatemala, the Oxford of 1914, Bretton Woods, even the cumbersome Diplodocus. or Diplodocus, according to where you're educated, roaming in the valley of the Thames, who didn't get as far as Oxford, a vast array of lost worlds, a vast array of lost worlds surveyed with inimitable style. I have concentrated on one strand of his argument, the uniqueness and vulnerability of our freedoms and our democracy. Because I am still in the business of building defences for those freedoms and standing up for that democracy and justice in the immediate hurly-burly of political life. And that is why I've pointed both to the dangers and to the opportunities. If we don't guard against the dangers and rise to the opportunities, Lord Stockton's heirs may in some distant lecture add us to his lost worlds. But as you've gathered from the title I chose, I am confident Britons will never lack brave hearts nor sound laws to defend their freedoms. And when injustice threatens, we can mobilize the common sense and common law of Britain and look to our parliamentary democracy to signal dangers and to shape or revise the laws. This year, as before in our history, we've seen men and women with brave hearts defying violence, scorning intimidation, and defending their rights to uphold our laws. By their action, we have seen a new birth of leadership in Britain, and that is the most important thing, the most enduring thing that is going to come out of this coal strike, a new birth of leadership. Individuals do count. Truth will prevail. Democracy does work and will endure, and we will defend it with our political lives. Let that be the message of this, the second Carlton Lecture.
Strange voice, but a very...
He had a very compelling voice. I mean, I actually liked Joseph MacLeod best, to be honest, going back those days. Stuart Hibbert, Joseph MacLeod, Alvar Liddell.
Yes.
Was there another one? Can't remember now. Can't remember. Ready to go?
Yes, just coming up now.
Fine.
Ready? In Alastair's own time.
Prime Minister, you said tonight that when a recalcitrant minority breaks the rules, you say there can be no consensus, we can't negotiate with them. Is that true of the Mine Workers' Union?
Well, I think the unions are obviously one body where a tiny fanatical minority can and seem to be able to take over a whole union and then say that they represent the whole union. Some of the tactics they use are to hold meetings at very short notice in places not advertised, and they somehow take over. You get the same thing sometimes in students' unions, where those who are keenest on work can't go to meetings and stay on and on and on and on and on, and then find that the vote isn't taken until there are only a few left, and those are the fanatics. This, I'm afraid, has become almost a standard tactic, both in Britain and in some other countries as well, and we must watch out for it, because they're not true representatives of the majority, and sometimes they deny the majority the right to speak, because they know they won't support the tiny minority.
Now, you talk about the ruthless, manipulating few. Now, will you not negotiate with them ever?
I will never negotiate with people who use coercion and violence to achieve their objective. They are the enemies of democracy. They are not interested in the future of democracy. They are trying to kill democracy for their own purposes.
What about people like, say, pensioners or single-parent families or black people who feel that they are a minority and yet they can't influence the majority who are in work or whose earnings are going up unless they do protest and demonstrate?
But they're not necessarily a recalcitrant minority. Minorities in this country are, of course, protected. Even the minority of one single individual is protected because we believe in human rights. And we believe that those human rights don't come from the state. They come from one's religious beliefs, not from the state. And therefore they can't be taken away from the state. And you'll remember in that lecture I quoted the famous case which occurred, I believe, when Lord Mansfield was Lord Chief Justice, where there was a slave in this country. And he said that if you breathed the air of Britain, you could not be a slave. You were a free man. That was a very long time ago, because the law developed to protect the rights even of individuals as well as the rights of minorities.
But are you worried about claims now that it's Tory judges and Tory justice?
Yes, of course I'm worried about it, because it is obviously untrue. It is to try to undermine the best system of law the world over, the system of common law that developed to protect our rights, to protect those rights of individuals, to protect that Negro way back in the 18th century.
But the Negro today would say he wasn't being protected by the law.
I would disagree with you very, very strongly indeed. We even have special laws to protect them. I think what you are saying is that there are some people who do not have respect for the law, who do not have respect for parliamentary democracy and are trying to manipulate the system. They are. Understand them for what they are. They are out for their own particular purposes. That has nothing to do either with the rights of the majority or with the human rights of the individual. And we must recognize what we are seeing for what it is.
Now, you've talked about nuclear technology and the need for vigilance. Are you encouraged by President Chernenko saying to Mr. Kinnock in Moscow today that the Soviet Union will stop targeting Britain if Britain gives up nuclear weapons?
No, I'm not impressed by that at all. He would, wouldn't he? You see, what we really need, if I might respectfully say so, I'm not quite certain that was an accurate quotation. But what we really need is the United States and the Soviet Union back at the table.
And that is happening now. Does that encourage
Yes, it is. May I just say one thing? I'm sorry. Could you cut for a moment? I would really rather you didn't say he would, wouldn't he? Because I don't.
No,
please,
right.
would you cut that bit
I'll
out?
put the
and
question
I
in.
rely on you not to.
Yes, I'll cut it down.
We'll put the
Please, would you
question
cut it out?
Yes,
Because
I'll
I
cut it
don't think. I'm sorry. I thought you were saying something
that's right,
else,
I
and
think.
I.
I'll put
yes.
the question again.
All right.
That's okay,
Right.
that's fine.
Good. Yes.
Okay, Jan? You spoke about nuclear technology and the need for ceaseless vigilance. Are you encouraged that President Chernenko has said to Mr. Kinnock in Moscow the Soviet Union won't target Britain if Britain gives up its nuclear weapons?
If war were ever to start, you could never rely on any such assurance. If you got even a conventional war starting, and conventional war is terrible, even if there were no nuclear weapons, the knowledge of how to make them is there, and there would be a race to make them. The great thing about equal possession of nuclear weapons is that they've prevented all wars. The purpose between nuclear powers of nuclear weapons is to deter and prevent wars. But we don't want enormous piles of them. But we want negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union to get down those stockpiles so we're still secure in a balance.
And what part can...
Secure at far lower numbers and far lower expense. And one must look at the whole thing, I believe, and treat it in that way. Less expense, but still in a balanced way. And that only that will lead to security.
And is there a part that a British initiative can play in this?
I think our best part to play is constant consultation with the United States and our allies. And they are very good. We are in very close consultation with the United States about this. But in the end, the main and first negotiations have got to take place between the United States and Soviet Union. Our nuclear weapons are only 2.5% our independent nuclear deterrent of the ballistic missiles possessed by the Soviet Union. So they've got a long way to go in nuclear disarmament of the large ballistic missiles before ours become significant in any way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Completely different, that hence you've got.
Can we
However,
offer something
the other
slightly
thing was
stronger?
just, you won't use it at all. Good.
Yes, we are. And,
yeah.
I will hand carry...
Sorry,
Sorry.
technically, just give us one moment.
Oh, yes, sorry. To clear the... Thank you.
Oh dear, not being photographed with a glass in my
With a glass of water.